You think you know the story of Jesus, right? He's probably one of the most famous figures in all of history. But what if I told you there are two very different versions of his story? Today, we're going to peel back 2,000 years of faith and tradition to go on a quest for the historical Jesus.
So let's just dive right in. On one hand, you've got the Christ of faith. This is the divine Son of God, worshipped for 2 millennia. But on the other hand, you have the actual man that historical and archaeological research is beginning to uncover. And, well, they're not exactly the same person. Our mission today is to dig into the evidence and explore that gap.
So where do you even start an investigation like this? Well, you have to go to the primary sources. And for Jesus, that means the Gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But historians immediately ask a really critical question. Should we actually be reading these as eyewitness accounts?
Okay, right off the bat, we hit a potential problem. Just look at this timeline. Jesus died around 30 AD, but the earliest gospel, Mark, wasn't written until 70 AD. That's a 40-year gap. And John's gospel, that might have been written 70 years after the fact. This makes it pretty much certain that these weren't written by people who were actually there, but by a later generation, kind of piecing together stories they had heard passed down.
And, that big time gap helps explain why you see so many contradictions. Take the story of the empty tomb, for example. In Matthew, it's this huge dramatic event outside the tomb. An angel comes down from heaven, there's an earthquake, the guards are terrified. But then you read Mark, and the women just walk into the tomb and see a young man sitting inside. These aren't just tiny details. It really suggests the writers were working from different oral stories, not a single, unified, first-hand memory.
And this quote from the scholar Rudolf Bultmann just nails it. He says the writers strung stories together like beads on a connecting string. What he means is that modern historians don't read the Gospels as straight biographies. They see them more as works of theology, or you could even say propaganda, written with a specific goal to convince you of a very specific religious message.
So if the Gospels aren't pure history, where do we look for the actual man? Are we just at a dead end? Well, no, not at all. The answer is to look at the world he actually lived in, the history, the culture, the archaeology of first-century Galilee.
And when historians do that, they find something fascinating. In Jesus' time, there was this tradition of charismatic holy men known as the Hasidim. And just look at this list of what they were like. Believed to work miracles, addressed God as Father, didn't care about wealth. Does this sound like anyone we know? It's remarkably familiar.
And get this, it wasn't just a general type of person. We have records of a contemporary of Jesus, a healer named Hanina ben Doza. And guess what? He was also famously called the Son of God, after a voice supposedly proclaimed it from the heavens. This context is absolutely crucial. It suggests Jesus wasn't some complete anomaly. He was operating within an existing Jewish tradition of holy men. Maybe he was the most powerful, the most charismatic of them all, but he fit a known pattern of his time.
Okay, so if the historical Jesus was a Jewish holy man, how on earth did he become the divine Son of God, worshipped by billions today? Well, that transformation is a story that unfolds in the decades and really the centuries after his death.
Now, what you've got to understand is that early Christianity wasn't just one thing. It was basically a battlefield of competing ideas about who Jesus was. You had the original Jerusalem church, led by his own brother James, who were still devout Jews. Then you had Paul preaching a much more supernatural, divine figure to non-Jews. And then you had other groups like the Gnostics who saw him as a mystical teacher of secret knowledge. All these groups had wildly different beliefs.
And we actually have a snapshot from an outsider from that exact time. The famous Jewish historian Josephus wrote about Jesus, and he confirms the basics. Yep, he was a real person, a wise teacher, and he was crucified by Pontius Pilate. But look at what's missing. Josephus makes zero claims about divinity, miracles, or resurrection. He's describing a man, not a god.
So you've got all these competing versions of Christianity floating around. How did one of them, the one that became mainstream, end up winning? The answer, and this might surprise you, has a lot more to do with politics than you'd think.
Fast forward to the 4th century. The Roman Empire is dealing with all this infighting among Christians, and it's actually causing political problems. So the emperor, Constantine, basically says, enough. He needs unity. So he calls all the bishops together at a place called Nicaea to hammer out one single official version of the faith once and for all.
And this is what they came up with. After weeks of, furious debate, they took a vote. And the result was the Nicene Creed, which, for the very first time, officially defined Jesus as being of one substance with the Father. This was it. This was the moment that the idea of Jesus being fully divine became official, state-sponsored doctrine.
And once that creed was set, the full power of the Roman state was used to enforce it. Any gospels or documents that contradicted the new creed were declared heresy, and, well, they were burned. Rival Christian groups were suppressed and eventually eliminated. So, through politics and sheer power, one version of Christianity became the version.
So where does all this leave us? After digging through the history, the texts, and the politics, we're basically left with two very, very different portraits of the same man. I think the theologian Albert Schweitzer put it perfectly. He said the historical Jesus will seem like a stranger and an enigma. He realized that the person you uncover using historical methods looks almost nothing like the Jesus presented by 2,000 years of church tradition. In fact, he said that knowledge might even be an offense to religion.
So let's just lay it all out. On the historical side, the evidence points to a first-century Jewish holy man, a healer and teacher from Galilee who never claimed to be God and had no intention of starting a new religion. On the faith side, you have the divine Son of God, part of the Trinity, who performs supernatural miracles and is the founder of Christianity. The two portraits are starkly different.
So what's the takeaway here? The point of this whole explainer isn't about proving or disproving anyone's faith. Not at all. It's about showing that this story is so much more complicated and fascinating than we usually think. We have one picture from the evidence of history and another from the tenets of faith, and that leaves us with a pretty profound question. How do we, today, navigate the space between what we can know from history and what we choose to believe?